Marcus Hale was finishing his coffee when an 80-year-old woman stepped up beside his booth, her hands trembling inside her coat, her eyes never staying still for long. "Can you tell me how to get to the police station?" she asked. The question sounded simple, but something about the way she said it wasn't. Marcus looked at her for a moment. "What do you need the police for?" She hesitated, like she was deciding how much to say. Then her voice dropped. "My daughter." A pause. "She's still in the house." Marcus slowly set his cup down, because now he knew this wasn't just a question. "Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. If this story moves you, please subscribe." A thin Idaho wind scraped across Idaho Falls that afternoon, carrying the kind of cold that settled quietly into bones and stayed there. Inside the roadside diner on Route 26, the world felt contained, warm, dim, and humming with small, ordinary sounds. The low buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, the soft clink of silverware against ceramic plates, the steady rhythm of a coffee pot being refilled somewhere behind the counter. It was the kind of place that had existed long enough to become invisible to the people who passed through it every day. Faded red booths, a checkered floor worn smooth in the walking paths, windows slightly fogged from the contrast between winter air and human heat. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hale sat in the far corner booth, back to the wall, where he could see both the entrance and the parking lot through the front windows without turning his head. He was 42, tall even when seated, with a broad-shouldered frame that spoke of years spent carrying weight without complaint. His face was sharply cut, defined jawline, high cheekbones, and the thin, pale scar running just above his right eyebrow, the kind that came from something fast and violent rather than accidental. His hair was cropped short in regulation Marine style, dark brown threaded with early gray at the temples, and his eyes were a cold, steady blue that rarely moved without reason. He wore a long-sleeve olive-green digital camouflage field shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms, paired with matching camo trousers and tan combat boots still dusted faintly with road salt from outside. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing that called attention, but there was a stillness to the way he occupied space that made people instinctively lower their voices when they stood too close. Marcus had spent nearly 2 decades in the United States Marine Corps, much of it attached to special operations units, where unpredictability wasn't an exception. It was the rule. Years of deployments had carved something quiet and deliberate into him. He wasn't the kind of man who reacted quickly. He was the kind who noticed first, calculated second, and acted only when the outcome mattered. At his feet, partially tucked beneath the table but not fully hidden, lay Ranger. Ranger was a 6-year-old German shepherd, large even for his breed, with a powerful chest and long, muscular limbs built for endurance rather than speed. His coat was thick and well-kept, a rich amber base layered with a deep black saddle that darkened along his spine and faded toward his flanks. His ears stood erect, constantly adjusting to the environment, and his eyes, sharp, intelligent, and unsettlingly focused, tracked movement in a way that suggested he was never truly at rest. Ranger had been trained as a K-9 unit partner for detection and protection work. He had seen more than most dogs ever should: crowded streets overseas, unstable environments, long nights where silence meant survival. Yet despite that, there was no visible aggression in him, no restless pacing or unnecessary tension. Only control. The kind that came from trust, discipline, and a bond forged through repetition and shared risk. At the moment, he appeared relaxed. His head rested low, chin near his front paws, but his eyes remained open, occasionally flicking toward the door each time it opened or the bell above it chimed. To anyone unfamiliar, he looked calm. To Marcus, he looked attentive. Marcus lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and let the warmth settle briefly against the cold that had followed him in from outside. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, which was, in itself, unusual. Most days, his mind ran in layers: past, present, contingency. Today, for once, there was quiet. The bell above the diner door rang. Marcus didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. The shift in air temperature, the subtle change in sound as the door opened, and the slight tightening in Ranger's posture told him enough. Someone had come in. Then Ranger moved. It wasn't dramatic, no barking, no sudden rise. Just a slow lift of the head, ears angling forward, eyes fixing on something near the entrance. His body remained low, but the tension beneath his fur changed, like a wire being pulled taut just enough to carry current. Marcus noticed that, and that alone was enough. He set his coffee down. A few seconds passed before the person approached. When Marcus finally looked up, he saw her standing just at the edge of the booth, close enough to speak, far enough to retreat if needed. Eleanor Whitaker was 80 years old, though the number didn't fully capture what time had done to her. She was small, barely reaching Marcus's shoulder, even standing upright. Her frame thin and fragile in a way that suggested both age and something less visible. Wear, perhaps, or long-term strain. Her gray hair was pulled back loosely into a low knot, strands escaping around her temples, catching the light in uneven silver lines. Her skin was pale and finely wrinkled, not just with age, but with a kind of persistent tension, as if her face had spent years bracing for something that never quite ended. She wore a heavy brown coat, the kind meant for winters harsher than this one, but it hung slightly too loose on her, as though she had lost weight recently or had never quite filled it to begin with. Her hands were tucked halfway into the sleeves, fingers curled inward, and Marcus noticed the tremor there. Not exaggerated, not theatrical, just a consistent, subtle shaking that didn't match the stillness she was trying to maintain. Her eyes were what held his attention. They were light gray, almost colorless in the diner lighting, and they moved, not wildly, but deliberately. A glance toward the door, a flick toward the window, then back to Marcus. Not nervous exactly, calculating, measuring distance, time, risk. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was soft, but controlled. Too controlled, like someone who had rehearsed the sentence before speaking it. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, giving her the space to continue. "Can you tell me how to get to the police station?" The question itself was simple. Everything around it was not. Marcus leaned back slightly, not enough to appear disengaged, just enough to study her more clearly. Ranger had shifted again, still lying down, but his gaze locked onto Eleanor now, unblinking. "What do you need the police for?" Marcus asked, his tone even, not probing, not dismissive. Eleanor's eyes moved again, this time toward the window. Outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly past before disappearing down the road. She followed it with her gaze until it was gone, then looked back at Marcus. For a moment, she didn't answer. Her right hand tightened slightly inside her sleeve. The tremor didn't stop, but it changed, less random, more restrained. When she finally spoke, her voice dropped just a fraction. "My daughter," she said. A pause, just long enough to matter. "She's still in the house." Marcus didn't move, but something inside him shifted. He didn't ask another question right away. He didn't need to. The sentence carried more weight than its words. Not at home, not waiting. Still in the house. Ranger exhaled slowly, a low, controlled breath, and adjusted his position without standing. His ears remained forward. Marcus gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit down," he said. Eleanor hesitated, not out of confusion, out of calculation. Her eyes flicked once more toward the door, then to the counter, then back to Marcus. She was deciding if staying was safer than leaving. Marcus didn't rush her. "I'll get you something warm," he added. That seemed to settle it. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor slid into the booth, but not fully. She positioned herself at the edge of the seat, angled slightly toward the aisle, her body unconsciously maintaining a clear path to the exit. Marcus noticed that too. Ranger's gaze followed her movement, then returned briefly to the door. Marcus signaled the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Carla, short, sturdy build, dark hair tied back, the kind of person who had worked in the same place long enough to read a situation without being told. She brought hot tea without asking questions. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink immediately. She was watching the window again. Marcus leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on the table, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the booth. "Tell me what's going on." Eleanor swallowed. Her grip tightened around the cup. And for the first time since she had walked in, her composure slipped, just enough for the fear beneath it to show. But she didn't explain, not yet. Instead, she looked at Marcus, really looked this time, and asked very quietly, "You're not going to leave, are you?" Marcus held her gaze. "No," he said. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling faintly against the diner windows. And under the table, Ranger slowly shifted his weight forward, as if preparing for something that hadn't happened yet, but would. Marcus Hale didn't interrupt her again, not immediately, because in his experience, the truth came out more clearly when it wasn't forced. And right now, Eleanor Whitaker wasn't just choosing what to say. She was deciding how much of her fear she could afford to reveal without losing control of it. And that calculation showed in the way her fingers tightened around the ceramic cup, in the slight tension along her jaw, in the way her eyes kept drifting toward the window as if expecting something to appear there at any second, while beneath the table, Ranger remained still, but no longer relaxed. His head lifted, body subtly angled toward the entrance, ears tracking every shift in the room with quiet precision that only someone trained to read danger would recognize. Eleanor finally took a sip of the tea, though it was clear she didn't taste it, and when she set the cup down, her hands didn't leave it, as if the warmth anchored her in a way words could not. "Her name is Rachel," she said, her voice steadier now but carrying something deeper than fear, something worn and exhausted. "Rachel Whitaker. She's 47. She used to be—" She stopped, searching for a version of her daughter that still existed somewhere in memory. "She used to laugh a lot." That detail lingered longer than the rest, not because it mattered to Marcus tactically, but because it mattered to Eleanor emotionally. And Marcus understood that often the difference between who someone was and who they had become told you more than any direct description ever could. "What changed?" Marcus asked, not pushing, just guiding. Eleanor's eyes lowered to the table, and for a moment, the diner's background noise seemed louder, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of distant conversation, the low hum of refrigeration units behind the counter, all of it pressing in around the small space of their booth as if reality itself was continuing on without noticing what was being said there. "Douglas," she said finally. "Douglas Crane." The name carried weight, and Marcus noted the way she said it, not with anger, but with caution. The kind people used when they had learned that even speaking about someone could have consequences. "He lives with her?" Marcus asked. Eleanor nodded once. "He moved in about a year ago. At first, he was polite, quiet, the kind of man who made you feel like you were the one talking too much. He always watched more than he spoke." She paused, and her fingers tightened again. "Then he started deciding things, small things at first, what she should cook, when she should call me, who she shouldn't talk to anymore." Marcus leaned back slightly, processing, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpened, because he had seen this pattern before, not in war zones, but in quieter places, in homes where control didn't arrive all at once, but built itself slowly until it replaced everything else. "What about now?" he asked. Eleanor inhaled, and the breath trembled halfway through. "Now he doesn't need to decide out loud anymore." Her eyes lifted, meeting Marcus's for the first time since she had started explaining. "Now she just knows." That was enough. Marcus didn't need her to describe violence in detail. The absence of description was often more telling than any explicit account. Ranger shifted slightly, his gaze moving from Eleanor to the front door as it opened briefly to let in a gust of cold air and a man in a heavy work jacket who stomped snow from his boots before heading to the counter. And for a moment, Eleanor's entire body went rigid, her eyes locking onto the man until he sat down and turned away. And only then did her shoulders lower again, just a fraction, just enough to show how tightly wound she had been. Marcus followed that reaction, not the man himself, but Eleanor's response to him, because fear didn't always attach to the right target, but it always revealed the presence of something else. "He knows you left?" Marcus asked. Eleanor shook her head quickly. "No, I waited until he went to the back of the house. He checks sometimes, not always, but enough." She swallowed, and the motion seemed to cost her effort. "If he realizes I'm gone." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Marcus rested his forearms on the table, leaning in just enough to lower his voice further, creating a space that felt contained, controlled. "Why not call the police from here?" Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the counter, toward Carla, then back. "Because if they come to the house and I'm not there," her voice dropped to almost nothing, "he'll take it out on her." That tracked. Control didn't end when someone left the room. It shifted targets. Marcus nodded once, slowly. "So you were going to walk?" "Yes." "To the station?" She nodded again. Marcus glanced briefly toward the window, calculating distance without needing a map. The nearest police station from this stretch of highway would be at least 3, maybe 4 miles. And in this cold, with her age, that wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Under the table, Ranger's tail made a single slow movement against the floor, not relaxed, not agitated, aware. Marcus sat back, letting a few seconds pass, not out of hesitation, but because decisions made too quickly in situations like this often missed something critical, and he had learned over years of experience that the difference between helping and making things worse was often measured in what you chose not to rush. "What's his pattern?" Marcus asked. "Douglas." Eleanor blinked, as if surprised by the question, but then answered. "He's home most evenings, leaves sometimes in the morning, not always the same time. He doesn't like people knowing where he is." "Anyone else in the house?" "No." "Locks?" She hesitated. "Yes, but..." "But what?" "He doesn't lock them to keep people out," she said quietly. "He locks them to keep her in." Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose, the smallest shift in his posture indicating the moment he moved from listening to planning. At the counter, Carla glanced over briefly, reading the tension without understanding the details, and chose not to approach again, which Marcus appreciated more than if she had asked questions. Eleanor's hands were still wrapped around the cup, but now they were steadier, not because she was less afraid, but because she had transferred part of that fear into the space between them, and Marcus understood that too. Understood that when people reached this point, they weren't just asking for help, they were deciding whether to trust someone else with the consequences of that help. "You did the right thing coming here," Marcus said. Eleanor looked at him, searching his face for something. Certainty, maybe, or reassurance that didn't feel empty. "Did I?" "Yes." It wasn't said loudly, and it wasn't dressed up with anything extra. It was just a statement, and that seemed to settle something in her, at least enough that she didn't argue with it. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, setting it on the table without dialing yet. He wasn't going to make the call in front of her until he knew exactly what information he needed to give, because vague reports led to delayed responses, and delay was not something this situation could afford. He looked at her again. "Address." Eleanor gave it to him, each word precise, as if she had repeated it in her head 100 times already. Marcus nodded, committing it to memory as much as the phone. Outside, the sky had shifted slightly, the light flattening into that early winter gray that came before dusk, and the wind picked up again, rattling faintly against the glass. Ranger rose slowly to his feet for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, not abruptly, not drawing attention, just a controlled movement that brought him closer to Marcus's leg, his body aligned, ready. Marcus noticed that too. He looked down briefly, then back at Eleanor. "You're not walking anywhere," he said. Eleanor opened her mouth as if to protest, but the words didn't come. "We're going to handle this," Marcus continued, calm, measured, leaving no space for uncertainty in the statement. "But we're going to do it the right way." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, and this time when she nodded, it wasn't hesitant. It was acceptance. And somewhere in that moment, something shifted, not the danger, not the situation, but the direction it was moving. Because for the first time since she had stepped into that diner, Eleanor Whitaker was no longer trying to solve it alone. The sky over Twin Falls had already begun to dim into that heavy gray that came too early in winter, flattening the landscape and draining color from everything it touched. As Marcus Hale guided his truck off the main road and onto a narrower residential street where the houses sat unevenly spaced, some maintained, others quietly deteriorating in ways that no one ever seemed to address directly. The drive from the diner had been silent for most of the way, not because there was nothing to say, but because both Marcus and Eleanor understood that this was the part where words stopped helping and decisions started carrying weight. And in the passenger seat, Eleanor Whitaker sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture rigid not from discomfort, but from anticipation, as if every passing mile tightened something inside her that had already been stretched too far for too long. Marcus had made the call 10 minutes earlier, pulling over briefly on the side of the road to speak to dispatch with the same controlled tone he used in every situation that mattered, giving only what was necessary: address, concern of domestic abuse, possible immediate risk, no escalation yet, because he knew that clarity determined response time, and response time, in situations like this, determined outcomes. The dispatcher on the other end had identified herself as Officer Lila Bennett, her voice steady, professional, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of handling calls that were never as simple as they first sounded. She was in her mid-30s, Marcus guessed from her voice, likely someone who had seen enough to recognize patterns quickly without needing them explained twice. She had told him units were limited in the area, that they would respond as soon as one became available, and Marcus had acknowledged that without pushing, because he understood constraints. But he also understood that waiting entirely was not an option. "2 blocks up," Eleanor said softly now, her voice almost lost under the hum of the engine. Marcus nodded once, eyes scanning the street ahead, noting the details automatically: driveways, sightlines, parked vehicles, the absence of people outside, the way curtains hung in windows, whether lights were on or off, and beside him, Ranger had shifted forward between the seats, his front paws braced lightly against the console, his body angled toward the windshield, ears forward, nose lifting slightly as if testing the air through the narrow crack Marcus had left in the window. Ranger was no longer simply attentive, he was working. The truck slowed as they approached a small, single-story house with aging white siding that had dulled into a muted gray over time, the paint chipped in places where weather had worn it down year after year without repair, and in the driveway sat a black pickup truck, large, heavy, the kind built more for presence than necessity, its surface dulled with a thin layer of dust and road grime that suggested regular use but little care. "That's his," Eleanor said, and the way she said it confirmed what Marcus had already assumed. Marcus eased the truck past the house, not stopping directly in front, instead continuing half a block further before pulling to the curb, engine idling for a moment before he shut it off completely, allowing the sudden quiet to settle around them. No barking dogs, no voices, no movement visible from the street. That didn't mean the house was empty. Marcus sat there for a second, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed forward as he built the situation in his head piece by piece, and beside him, Eleanor had gone completely still, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if looking directly at the house would make it more real than she was ready for. Ranger shifted again, stepping down from the console and moving toward Marcus's side, his body low but not crouched, his muscles held in that controlled readiness that spoke of training rather than instinct alone. Marcus turned slightly toward Eleanor. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm but firm enough to anchor her attention. "You stay here." Her head turned toward him quickly. "I need to—" "I know," Marcus cut in, not harsh but decisive. "You want to go to her, I get that. But if you go up there right now, you change the situation." Eleanor's lips pressed together, and for a moment it looked like she might argue anyway, but something in Marcus's tone, something that didn't leave room for negotiation, held her in place. "He doesn't know you're gone yet," Marcus continued. "That's an advantage. We don't give that up." Her eyes flicked toward the house, then back to him. "What if he hurts her?" Marcus held her gaze. "Then we make sure we're in a position to stop it." The answer wasn't comforting. It wasn't meant to be. It was honest, and that was what she needed more than reassurance that might not hold. After a moment, she nodded, slow, reluctant, but accepting. Marcus reached for the door handle, then paused, looking down at Ranger. "Stay close," he said quietly. Ranger's ears twitched once in acknowledgement, his focus already fixed beyond the truck, toward the direction of the house. Marcus stepped out into the cold, the air biting immediately through the fabric of his uniform, sharper now as the wind picked up across the open stretch of road, carrying with it the faint smell of snow that hadn't started falling yet, but would soon. He closed the door softly behind him, not slamming it, not drawing unnecessary attention, and waited a second for Ranger to step out beside him, the dog moving with controlled precision, no wasted motion, his paws silent against the pavement. They began walking back toward the house. Marcus didn't rush. Speed drew attention. Attention escalated situations. Instead, he moved at a steady, deliberate pace, hands relaxed at his sides, posture open but grounded, the way someone approached a door when they intended to talk, not confront, even if confrontation remained a possibility. As they drew closer, Ranger's behavior shifted again. His head lowered slightly, nose working the air, his body angling just a fraction to Marcus's left, positioning himself in a way that allowed him to see both the house and the yard without crossing directly in front of Marcus's path. Marcus noticed the truck again as they passed it, the driver's door slightly misaligned, a shallow dent near the rear panel, mud dried thick along the tires. And details like that mattered, not because they told a complete story, but because they hinted at patterns: neglect, aggression, carelessness. The front yard was small, patchy grass giving way to dirt near the walkway, a plastic chair sitting on the porch, its surface worn and slightly cracked from exposure, and a single porch light glowed faintly above the door, casting a weak yellow circle that did little to push back the growing dusk. Marcus stopped at the base of the short concrete path, just for a second, just long enough to listen. Nothing obvious. No shouting. No movement that carried through the walls. That didn't mean there was nothing happening inside. He stepped forward. Behind him, Ranger remained close, not touching, not crowding, but present, his eyes fixed on the front door, his body aligned with Marcus in a way that spoke of long familiarity, of knowing exactly where he needed to be without being told. Marcus reached the porch and paused again, his gaze flicking once to the window beside the door, where a thin curtain hung loosely, light filtering through from inside, but no clear movement visible beyond it. He lifted his hand and knocked. 3 times. Firm, even, not aggressive. Then he stepped back half a pace, giving space, giving the person inside the impression of control. Because people were more predictable when they believed they still had it. Silence followed. Then, faintly, movement. Footsteps, not rushed, not light, measured. Marcus felt Ranger's posture tighten beside him, just slightly, just enough to register that whatever was coming to the door mattered. The handle turned. The door opened a few inches, held by a chain. And someone stood on the other side. Marcus didn't move. But every sense he had narrowed to that opening, because whatever came next would decide everything. The door opened only a few inches at first, held in place by a thin metal chain stretched tight across the frame. And in that narrow gap stood Rachel Whitaker, her presence filling the space not with strength, but with a quiet, contained fragility that Marcus Hale recognized immediately as something built over time rather than born into it. Because Rachel was the kind of woman who had once been vibrant in ways that left traces even now, despite everything that had worn her down. She was 47, medium height, but appearing smaller because of the way she held herself, shoulders slightly rounded inward as if protecting something unseen. Her dark brown hair pulled loosely back into a low tie that had begun to slip, strands falling across a face that was pale not just from lack of sunlight, but from a kind of long-term strain that had drained color from it gradually. Her skin fine and delicate, her eyes a muted hazel that might have been warm once but now carried a constant, watchful tension, like someone who had learned to listen for changes in tone rather than words. There was no visible injury, no immediate sign of violence, but Marcus didn't need one. The way she stood, the way her gaze flicked briefly past him before settling back, the way her hand remained on the edge of the door as if she might close it at any second, all of it told him what he needed to know. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice controlled, polite in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. "My name's Marcus," he said, keeping his tone even, steady, the kind that didn't push or challenge, just existed. "I met your mother up the road. She's safe." For a fraction of a second, something broke through Rachel's composure. Not relief exactly, but recognition, followed immediately by caution as her eyes shifted past Marcus again, scanning the street until they found Eleanor standing beside the truck half a block away, her small figure unmistakable even at that distance. And in that moment, the tension in Rachel's face changed, tightening not from fear alone, but from conflict. "She shouldn't have gone out," Rachel said quietly, and the words carried more weight than their surface meaning, because they weren't about disapproval, they were about consequence. Marcus didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. Instead, he shifted his stance just slightly, enough to angle his body in a way that kept the doorway in view while still appearing open, non-threatening. "I just need to know you're okay," he said. Rachel's fingers tightened on the door. "I'm fine." The answer came too quickly. Marcus held her gaze for a second longer than most people would have, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear that he wasn't taking the word at face value. "I'd still like to hear that from you outside," he said. That was the moment everything changed, because behind Rachel, deeper inside the house, there was movement, heavier this time, more deliberate, and the shift in Rachel's posture was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. Her shoulders drawing in further, her head tilting just slightly as if bracing for something that hadn't yet reached the doorway but would within seconds. Then Douglas Crane stepped into view. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The way he moved carried its own kind of authority, the kind built not on confidence but on control, and he filled the space behind Rachel in a way that made the doorway feel smaller, tighter, as if the house itself adjusted around him. He was a large man, not just tall but broad in a way that suggested past physical strength that had settled into something heavier, his shoulders thick, his arms heavy with muscle that had softened slightly but not weakened, his face square and blunt, jaw unshaven with several days' worth of dark stubble that framed his mouth in uneven lines, his hair cut short but not maintained, strands pushing outward as if he didn't care enough to keep it in order, and his eyes, dark, steady, and entirely unreadable, moved from Marcus to the street, then back again, taking in everything without appearing to rush the process. "Who's this?" Douglas asked, his voice low, controlled, carrying easily without needing volume. Marcus didn't change his posture. "Just someone who spoke with her mother," he said, nodding slightly toward Rachel. "Wanted to make sure she got back safe." Douglas's gaze shifted again, this time lingering on Marcus a fraction longer, measuring, assessing, and there was something in that look that Marcus had seen before, not just suspicion, but calculation, the kind that ran scenarios quietly in the background, weighing outcomes before choosing a response. "She's fine," Douglas said. "You can go." The words were simple, but the tone behind them wasn't a request. Marcus didn't move. Ranger stood beside him, silent, perfectly still, but his focus had locked entirely onto Douglas now, his body angled slightly forward, weight balanced in a way that could shift instantly if needed, and though he made no sound, there was something unmistakable in his presence, something that said he was not simply a pet, not simply a companion, but something trained, something aware. Douglas noticed that. His eyes flicked down briefly to Ranger, then back up, and for the first time, there was the smallest change in his expression. Not fear, not even concern, but recognition. Marcus used that moment. "I'm going to need to speak with her outside," he said, still calm, still even, but now there was something firmer beneath it, something that didn't yield easily. Douglas's jaw shifted slightly, a tightening that suggested irritation rather than surprise. "You don't need anything," he replied. Behind him, Rachel hadn't moved, but her eyes had shifted again, this time not toward Marcus, not toward Douglas, but toward the street, toward Eleanor, and Marcus followed that glance just long enough to confirm what he already suspected, that the presence of her mother had changed something inside her, something that had been held down long enough to feel permanent until it wasn't. Marcus looked back at her. "Rachel," he said, using her name deliberately, grounding the moment in something personal rather than procedural. "You can step outside if you want to." Silence. Douglas didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His presence filled the gap, the kind of silence that pressed rather than settled. Rachel's hand tightened again on the door. Her breathing changed, slightly faster, slightly shallower, and for a moment it looked like she might say something, might refuse, might retreat back into the safety of what she knew, even if that safety was only the absence of immediate conflict. Then she looked at Marcus again, and something shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough. "I'm just going to talk," she said, her voice quiet but clearer than before. Douglas's gaze moved to her, and this time there was something sharper in it. Not anger yet, but resistance, the kind that came when control was challenged in small ways that mattered more than larger ones. "You don't need to go anywhere," he said. Rachel didn't look at him. That, more than anything else, changed the balance. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak, didn't push further. He simply waited. Douglas held his position for another second, then another, and Marcus could almost see the calculation happening. The recognition that forcing the situation now, with someone standing at the door and another visible on the street, might create a problem larger than the one he was trying to prevent. Slowly, deliberately, Douglas stepped back. It wasn't a retreat, it was a decision. Rachel exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and with that, she slid the chain free from the door. The metal clink was small, but in that moment, it sounded louder than anything else in the world. She opened the door wider, stepped out, and for the first time since Marcus had arrived, she crossed the threshold. Behind her, Douglas remained inside, watching. Marcus stepped aside slightly, giving her space, not guiding, not directing, just making it clear that the path was open. Rachel moved down the porch steps slowly, her gaze fixed ahead, toward Eleanor, who had already begun walking toward her despite everything Marcus had said earlier. Because some things couldn't be held back once they started. They met halfway. Eleanor reached her first, hands trembling, touching Rachel's arms as if confirming she was real. And Rachel stood still for a second before her shoulders dropped, just slightly, the tension easing in a way that suggested she had not allowed herself to feel that moment in a long time. Marcus stayed where he was. Ranger didn't move. And behind them, inside the doorway, Douglas Crane watched everything. Not speaking, not stepping forward, but not stepping away either. The quiet after control breaks. The street had gone still in a way that didn't feel peaceful, only suspended, as if everything in that narrow stretch of Twin Falls was waiting for something to resolve itself. And Marcus Hale remained at the edge of the porch steps, his posture unchanged, his presence steady but deliberately unobtrusive. Because he understood that what was unfolding now was no longer about intervention. It was about transition. and transitions were fragile in ways that force could easily break. Rachel Whitaker stood in the middle of that fragile space, her mother's hands still resting lightly on her arms, not gripping, not pulling, just holding contact as if both of them needed confirmation that the other was truly there. And Eleanor Whitaker, 80 years old and carrying more weight than her frame had any right to bear, had begun to tremble again, not from cold this time but from release, the kind that came when fear that had been held in place for too long finally found somewhere to go. Behind them, the front door remained open, and Douglas Crane had not moved far from it, his silhouette framed by the dim interior light, his presence no longer dominating the space in the same way, but still present enough to remind everyone that the situation had not fully resolved. And Marcus kept him in his peripheral vision, not staring, not challenging, but never losing track, because men like Douglas did not always react predictably when control slipped away from them. Ranger stood beside Marcus, weight balanced, head slightly lowered, eyes locked on Douglas with a focus that did not waver, his entire body communicating readiness without aggression, the quiet certainty of a trained K-9 that understood both restraint and response. Then, in the distance, the sound came. Not loud, not urgent, but unmistakable. The low approach of an engine moving with intention rather than speed. And within seconds, a patrol cruiser turned onto the street, headlights cutting through the early evening gray, slowing as it approached the house, before coming to a controlled stop behind Marcus's truck. And a second vehicle followed shortly after, positioning itself at an angle that provided a clear line of sight to both the house and the surrounding area, without escalating the scene unnecessarily. The first officer out of the cruiser was Officer Lila Bennett, and in person she matched the impression her voice had given earlier. Mid-30s, average height, lean build that suggested endurance rather than strength. Her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail that emphasized the sharpness of her features. Her skin lightly weathered in a way that came from years spent working outdoors in all conditions. And her eyes, clear, focused, and direct, moved quickly across the scene, taking in Marcus, Ranger, the two women, and finally Douglas in the doorway, assembling the situation in seconds without asking a single question yet. She moved with calm efficiency, not rushing, not hesitating, her hand resting near her radio but not on her weapon, signaling control without escalation. Her partner, Officer Daniel Ortiz, stepped out of the second vehicle a moment later, a man in his early 40s with a broader build, his shoulders thick, his posture relaxed but alert, his face marked by a trimmed beard and a small scar along his chin that spoke of something older, something that had left its mark without defining him entirely. And he took up a position slightly to the side, giving Bennett a clear path forward while maintaining a visual on Douglas and the house itself. Bennett approached Marcus first. "You the one who called?" she asked, her tone neutral but attentive. Marcus gave a slight nod. "Marcus Hale," he said. "Situation's contained for now. No escalation." Her gaze flicked briefly to Ranger, then back to Marcus, a small acknowledgement passing through her expression that said she understood what kind of control that required. "Anyone inside besides him?" she asked, tilting her head subtly toward Douglas. "Not anymore," Marcus replied. "Woman stepped out voluntarily." Bennett nodded once, then shifted her attention to Rachel and Eleanor, her voice softening slightly without losing its clarity. "Ma'am," she said to Rachel, "I'm going to need to speak with you for a moment." Rachel hesitated just for a second, her eyes moving instinctively toward Douglas, who still stood in the doorway, and that reflex alone told Bennett everything she needed to know about the dynamic inside that house. "You can stay right here," Bennett added, positioning herself just enough between Rachel and the house to create a subtle barrier without making it obvious. "He's not going anywhere." At that, Ortiz moved slightly closer to the porch, his stance widening just enough to signal presence, his eyes fixed on Douglas without aggression but with clear intent. And Douglas, for the first time, shifted his weight, a small movement that betrayed the internal recalculation happening behind his steady expression. "What's going on?" Douglas asked, his voice still controlled, but thinner now, less certain. Bennett turned toward him, her posture straightening, her tone firming without raising. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside," she said. Douglas didn't move immediately. "I didn't call anyone," he replied. "That's fine," Bennett said. "You're still going to step outside." There was a pause, and in that pause, Marcus could see the moment Douglas understood that the balance had shifted in a way he could no longer manage through presence alone. And slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold of his own house, the same way Rachel had moments earlier, but with none of the release, none of the quiet relief. Only control being reassembled in a different form. Ortiz moved to meet him halfway, positioning himself just enough to guide without touching, and Douglas complied, not resisting, not cooperating fully either, just choosing the option that maintained the most control in a situation where control was already slipping. Behind them, Bennett turned back to Rachel. "Are you safe?" she asked. Rachel's lips parted, then pressed together again, and for a moment it seemed like she might default to the same answer she had given Marcus earlier, the same conditioned response that had kept everything contained. But Eleanor's hand tightened slightly on her arm, not urging, not forcing, just reminding, and something in Rachel shifted again. "No," she said quietly. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, heavier than it sounded. Bennett nodded once. "All right," she said. "We're going to take this one step at a time." The next hour unfolded in fragments, questions asked, answers given, statements begun and paused and resumed again, and Marcus remained where he was, stepping back further as the process took over, because he understood that this part belonged to the system, not to him. And Ranger settled beside him, finally lowering himself to the ground, though his eyes never fully left the scene. Rachel spoke with Bennett, her voice gaining steadiness with each sentence, not because the fear had disappeared, but because it was no longer contained entirely within her, and Eleanor stood close, her presence constant, grounding, while Ortiz guided Douglas toward the cruiser, the man offering no resistance, but no acknowledgement either, his silence now different from before, not controlled, but empty. At some point, the front door of the house closed, left behind without ceremony, the porch light still casting that weak yellow glow onto the steps where no one stood anymore. And the street, once tense, began to settle into something quieter, something that resembled normalcy, but wasn't quite the same. Rachel turned back toward Marcus eventually. Her expression changed, not free, not yet, but lighter in a way that suggested the weight she had been carrying was no longer hers alone. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his without hesitation for the first time. "For not leaving." Marcus gave a small nod. "We just did what needed doing." It wasn't meant to be profound. It wasn't meant to stay with her, but it did anyway. Later that night, in a county facility where the lights were softer and the air carried none of the tension that had filled that house, Rachel and Eleanor sat side by side in a small room, a blanket draped loosely over Eleanor's shoulders, Rachel's hand resting lightly over hers, not out of necessity, but choice. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, they allowed themselves to rest without listening for footsteps, without measuring silence for what might come next. Outside, the first snow began to fall, light and steady, covering the ground in a thin, quiet layer that softened the edges of everything it touched. And for the first time in a long while, the night did not feel like something to endure. Sometimes miracles don't come as something grand. They come as the right person showing up at the exact moment you need them. Maybe God doesn't always remove the darkness, but He sends someone to lead you out of it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to support more meaningful stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace into your life.